Oh, okay. We had feedback for a second, but it looks like we're okay. Welcome to the first meeting of the Future of Public Education in Vermont Commission of 2025. I will just do a quick roll call. I'll call the folks that I see on my screen, and then we will get started. Jay, you're first.
Jay Nichols, Executive Director of the Vermont Principals Association and the VPA rep to this commission.
Thanks. Anne?
Ann Cummings, Vermont State Senate, Senator and rep to this commission.
Elizabeth?
Elizabeth Jennings, I'm the Director of Finance and Operations for Addison Northwest School District, and I am the representative for this commission from Vasbo.
Thanks. Oliver?
Oliver Olson, I'm the appointee of the Vermont Independent Schools Association.
Mike?
Mike Licklider, Superintendent of the Harwood Unified Union School District and representative of the Vermont Superintendents Association.
Thanks. Zoe?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education.
Peter?
Peter Conlon, State Representative, appointed member from the Vermont House.
Craig?
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Craig Bolio, the Tax Commissioner.
Jeff?
Jeff Fannin, Executive Director of Vermont NEA and the appointee of Vermont NEA to this commission.
Jennifer?
Good afternoon. Jennifer Deck Samuelson, Chair of the Vermont State Board of Education.
And John?
Good afternoon, everyone. John Castle, Executive Director of the Vermont Rural Education Collaborative.
Thanks, everyone. I'm Megan Roy, Chair of the Commission, and here as a former member of the Act 173 Advisory Group. We are missing Nicole Mace. She's not able to make it today. She's our the designee for the Vermont School Boards Association. So before we jump in, commission members, are there any adjustments to the agenda that you would like us to consider? Oliver?
Thanks. Maybe not a formal adjustment. And perhaps we can handle it under the subcommittee update and reaffirm charge heading. But I think it might be helpful to have some discussion about our work plan for the upcoming year. So I don't know how you might want to handle that, but I think we're at a point where we probably should have that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll get ahead just a little bit of the update from the steering group. That's the bulk of what the steering group talked about at their meeting in December. So I'll have someone else update. They did not develop a work plan. They acknowledged the need to develop a work plan. And given that the first 2 weeks of the legislative session are happening, they acknowledge that it would be important today to affirm our subcommittees and what their charges are. And today is really meant to be pretty informative so that the commission and the steering group can react to anything coming out of the session in these early minutes. So that's a long yes. It will be addressed somewhat in the steering group. And then the other agenda item further down, input for work plan, is so that when the steering group meets next week, they can have the perspective of the commission as they refine it.
Okay.
Any other adjustments? Okay, hearing none. Can I have a motion to approve the meeting minutes from December 16th? Sorry, Jay, was that for a motion or a adjustment? Go ahead.
I make a motion to approve the minutes from our last meeting from December 16th, 2024.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
Thanks, Oliver. Any questions, discussion, things to change?
I think on page 3 in Nicole Mace's comments, it should be upcoming year and not year. But other than that.
Thank you for catching that. Anything else? Right. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Since there are no nays or abstentions, I will not do a roll call. So thanks, everyone. We have an opportunity for public comment. Just as a reminder, we have an opportunity at the beginning and at the end of today's meeting. We have had good luck with just not having to limit folks' time, but if we do have a lot of people who want to share, we will have to do that. And just a reminder, this isn't the opportunity for a back and forth. The commission likely can't respond, although sometimes we can if it's really logistical, but we'll take your input into consideration for a future meeting, and sometimes we'll follow up directly with an individual. So I see one hand, Marcy. There's at least one other person who would like to make comments. So you can raise your hand and I'll call on you in order. Marcy, you can get us started.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to comment. I'm sure there will be something significant on ed funding that comes out of the legislature.
I apologize. I don't mean to interrupt, but if folks, when they give public comment, could tell us your full name, where you're from, that'd be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. I'm Marcy Harding. I live in Richmond. I'm simply an interested citizen who spent a lot of time last year trying to understand the education funding system and trying to identify something akin to a solution to the problems that you're all trying to address. And I've been pretty unsuccessful in doing that, except to say that I'm sure there will be something significant that comes out of the legislature this year on education funding. And maybe the CLA, Common Level of Appraisal, will be moot at that point in time. But the CLA change made last year is very much not moot right now. It's unfortunate Nicole Mace is not here because I think she has probably input from school boards, but I think school boards have to understand it and explain it now or in the upcoming couple months. I expect the tax department is grappling with it. I also thought about Julia Richter trying to explain the whole ed funding system and the CLA component of it to new legislators. And I question whether, I'm curious to know whether the Agency of Education has done the outreach required in H887. The Brainstorm document that you've all been working on includes reversal of last year's change as a policy discussion. The discussion includes the compelling justification for doing so. First, it says, under the discussion, it says allows districts to build budgets with consistency. I think that's important, but more so, secondly, the discussion includes the following: changing the calculation with no direct correlation to saving any funds or increasing outcomes builds confusion and lack of trust. That's why this change never should have been made last year, and that's why it should be reversed this year. Just like reversing the 5% cap last year, the CLA change is urgent now. It's unfortunate that the commission didn't identify that item as a recommendation in its report. I hope the commission will elevate it to the top of the priority list now. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcy. Mill Moore, go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, Chair Roy and members of the commission. Happy New Year to all. I'm Mill Moore, a 45-year resident of Heartland, Vermont. Many of you know me from my past work with the Vermont Independent Schools Association, but I want to stress that I'm no longer an independent schools advocate. I retired from that work in August of 2023. Now I'm a taxpayer advocate and a citizen of a school district that experienced a 29% tax increase for the current year. So as you begin the second phase of your legislative mandate, I want to highlight an important idea in the Commission's Brainstorm document, which is to address staff to student ratios. That idea appears on lines 30 and 31 in the list. I hope everybody on this commission already knows that Vermont's student-teacher ratio is the lowest in the nation. That's an enormous red flag because roughly 3/4 of all school spending is on staff salaries and benefits. So if 3/4 of all ed spending is supporting the worst in the USA student-teacher ratio, that alone is compelling reason for further attention. So my recommendation and request is that you make controlling staffing costs a high priority going forward. Though rising health insurance costs were a trigger when last year's crisis came about, the underlying problem is that staffing costs in low student-teacher ratio schools have increased to extraordinary levels at many, many Vermont schools. The current ratio is around 10.5 to 1. Half of Vermont schools have higher ratios, which is a very good thing, including many with ratios above 12 to 1 and a few going above 14 to 1. But sadly, in the other half, there are schools with ratios beneath 9 to 1 and even a few down at 7 to 1. Now, an important point to understand is that as far as these ratios are concerned, consolidating small schools will not by itself solve the low ratio problem. That is because there's no correlation between enrollment size and student-teacher ratio. You can find high ratios and low ratios at large schools as well as small schools. So the question I suggest this commission should be asking is, why are dozens of Vermont schools able to operate with student-teacher ratios at or in excess of 12 to 1? What are they doing that lower performing schools can emulate? Working on reducing staffing costs, I think, can be done by identifying successful staff management techniques in the schools with already high ratios and by devising fiscal incentives to help correct the problem going forward. And I think many Vermont school districts can help inform you on how they are accomplishing that now. Then I just have one other thing I want to add, another recommendation. I'm concerned that what I call paralysis by analysis is a real danger for this commission. Avoid the temptation to ask for more and more data. You don't need more data, nor do you need ever deeper dives into the data pool to see big picture issues. We already have enough data for that, including the obvious low student to staff ratio problem. So to deliver a compelling report to the legislature next December, keep your focus on the big picture problems. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mel. Is there anyone else who would like to address the commission? I do not see hands, but you can unmute or raise your hand. I'm going to move us on. We do have another opportunity at the end of the meeting for public comment. If we missed someone, and you can certainly submit any comments in writing if you would like. So move us to our next agenda item. This is typically our subcommittee updates. I believe that the steering group is the only group that met immediately following our September 16th meeting. And I alluded to this in response to Oliver's question, but I'll ask a member of the steering group to summarize the conversation. There were two purposes for meeting right after the full commission meeting. The first was just to affirm any editing changes that needed to go in the report, and then starting a conversation about work planning for this coming year, as we will, at least if we continue to function based on our charge, we will need to, I would say, refine our work plan now that we are not focused on the preliminary report. So does a member of the subcommittee want to summarize the conversation? Peter.
Okay, I may not have it all, But the first thing we needed to do was devise an agenda for today's meeting. And I think that the consensus was, while we're sort of figuring out our relationship with the legislative process and how we can both work best to help one another out, we thought we'd take advantage of this meeting to really become informed on issues that we know will be coming up, which is why you have the agenda for today that's in front of you. Then we decided that we would meet on the 13th to give the legislature a chance to get started, to get the people who are going to be appointed to the key committees dealing with the issues that are before us appointed, and then perhaps get some input, or at least a better sense of things before the meeting on the 13th, at which point we will hopefully be able to come up with a clearer work plan for the commission for February and forward. Is that about right?
Thanks, Peter. Jennifer, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add, we also discussed the idea, we had originally been scheduled to meet in person, and after some discussion, we decided to meet virtually, in part because with the holidays, there just wasn't a whole lot of time to get work done, but also our consultant is not quite up and running yet, I don't believe, or wouldn't have been by today's meeting. So we decided to not have another public engagement session this afternoon without the benefit of the consultant, and just, moved it to a virtual platform with just today's meeting scheduled.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'd agree, and I'd add, we know as a group that as we design with our consultant community engagement, what we are asking for with that engagement is also going to evolve from really open-ended, and maybe we'll always have a certain amount of open-ended, but it will become more refined, I think, especially to the extent that the commission is reacting to ideas, asking for additional input, being kind of recursive. And so that was another reason. So questions, comments for the steering group from members, Oliver and then Jay.
Okay, raise hand. Where can I raise hand?
So as I'm thinking about our deliverable in December, and I'm sort of mentally working my way back from that deliverable, and I'm thinking about the number of meetings we have between now and then, I'm concerned right now with where we're at, and I guess what I would see is the lack of a clear plan with milestones that will actually get us there. And so I would just suggest that we really need to accelerate a clear plan with specific milestones, and I think we need to be realistic about really what we're going to be able to accomplish in the remaining time that we have.
Thanks, Oliver. I'll jump in a little bit before, just on that comment, if it's okay, before moving to you, Jay. And Anne, I did see your hand.
Okay.
And just to sort of, to that point, Oliver, I agree. And I think the tenor of the conversation with the steering group also agrees. And I think there was a really, I think there is a real discussion about the speed at which the legislature is going to need to do its work, and whether or not that impacts the original charge of this commission. We, in our preliminary report, we asked, we acknowledged that this commission was created by the legislature because it brought together various perspectives and a mechanism to do really important and complex work. And it is a structure that is sometimes not really fast. And so the legislature is going to have to decide exactly how it wants to engage. And it could be exactly as written or differently. And so part of today, kind of to restate Peter's summary, is what can we do that is useful and productive to us irregardless, as we also allow the legislature to at least have a conversation about what our role will be moving forward. So I'm just kind of affirming what you're saying, Oliver. I don't think anyone is disputing the need to have a really concrete plan. And we don't want to create and map out an entire plan today without knowing if there's going to be any sort of refinement of our charge or anything like that. Jay and then Ann.
Well, some of my stuff got said in the conversation back and forth between you and Oliver, so I appreciate that. So I'll go to the pragmatic. First of all, just to reiterate on that, I think I said this before, I don't want this commission work to be wasted. I want it to be something that's meaningful. And if the General Assembly and or the administration decide that they don't really want to use the commission, don't need the commission process is too slow, whatever, then let's get rid of the commission and not play the game. Let's just do it in the General Assembly. I'm okay with that. My more pragmatic question is, what is our status in terms of the contract with the engagement person? Because I think we need that person on board. And I agree with Oliver in that I want to see us get a plan together. But I also agree, Megan, with what the steering committee is. We got to see what the direction of the General Assembly and quite frankly, the administration. Hopefully Zoe and Craig can weigh in a little bit about that today to decide, where should we go moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I have a logistical, I was actually just trying to pick up my email and I can't exactly find it. So Shelley Matz from the AOE is coordinating that portion and is going back and forth with the firm that we have moved forward. And my understanding is that when I left it in December was the agency had just forwarded the materials needed to their general counsel. And that's where it is. I don't know, Zoe, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit. I don't know if you have an update. It's okay if you don't. But that's my understanding, is that it is moving through its process of developing a contract.
Yeah, I don't have an update as of this morning, but I did sign off on it over the holiday to move it through that next step. But certainly in a moment, I'll have an update.
Thanks. Ann, go ahead. I think you had your hand up.
Just the 13th might be a little premature. The governor has asked that all the education and the money committees all meet together. I believe I'm going through all my emails. The first meeting is the 13th to propose his plan, which will be the first time next week, tomorrow. We have to elect, at least in the Senate, the committee on committees, and then they have to meet and they have to name the committee. So at least on our end, there won't be time to talk. And the first time we will have, then all the bills have to be read and sent over. So the first time we'll know anything concrete about a proposal will probably be the next week. I believe the governor's asked for 4 meetings in these first weeks to present his plan. I don't know if Peter knows any more than that, or Zoe, but the 13th might be a little premature to get a sense as to what the legislature's doing, because this first year we aren't going to do much except get our assignments in that first week.
Yeah, and I'll just clarify what I meant by hear from the legislature. This is really about whether or not the legislature is going to continue to have the commission function as it currently functions. This is not necessarily anticipating having proposals by the 13th. This is more, right now we exist. We're put into legislation. We have a timeline and a deliverable, and we're operating on that timeline. And there's a recognition that it may be helpful for us to refine that, or the legislature may refine our role. And it's a challenging situation to keep us going on some sort of track so that we don't lose daylight while we also have the opportunity to react. And so I would say the steering group opted to meet on the 13th, not anticipating that they would have all the answers, but to give us a chance to be together, at least plan what February would look like. So I just wanted to clarify, I don't think anyone is expecting to have proposals from the legislature, but I do think the legislature, we're at risk of having parallel processes. That's another thing we talked about in our report is we shouldn't be working at cross purposes. We were convened to serve a purpose. We need to make sure that that is still the purpose the legislature needs us to do. And so it could be that next week when the steering group meets, they schedule another information type agenda similar to the one we have today. And this commission needs to inform the steering group about how it can spend its time. So that's part of why it's on the agenda for today. Peter.
I would also add that we may have at least a better understanding of what the legislature won't get to this session that is still within the statutory description of what this commission is supposed to be addressing. So I think that there's work we can do while sort of the legislature, and we keep saying the legislature, but I think the administration has made clear that they're going to come forward with a plan. I don't right now the details of that seem to be being introduced in coordination with the governor's budget address on the 28th. Certainly hoping that that gets moved up. We in the legislature would just assume get rolling as quick as possible. But anyway, that's just to say, I think there's always going to be plenty for us to do. So we can also talk about a lot of that at our steering committee meeting as well.
Peter. Other comments, updates, questions for the steering group? So I would also add part of the affirm the charge of our subcommittee structure. I don't know that we talked specifically about every single subcommittee, but we did have a little bit of a conversation as a steering group around the education finance subcommittee, and that committee itself had a little bit of this conversation at its last meeting. What does the commission, the steering group, want the role of the finance committee to be as it moves forward? That's part of why it's on the agenda for today. I am interested if folks have immediate thoughts on this. As of this moment, the finance subcommittee continues to have meetings on its calendar and expects to pick back up their work. We, as a group on today's agenda, might have a conversation about prioritizing order of discussion of some of the items in the brainstorming document. So they are moving forward as if that is continuing to be their charge. But that's part of this conversation, is making sure, is it that the likelihood of action being taken going to focus on finance, and therefore that is not the right structure? And then what is? So we're sort of speculating right now, but I didn't know if any steering group or otherwise had thoughts or suggestions around affirming the charges of our subcommittees. Jennifer, yeah, go ahead.
So I'm not really sure which, hole to slot this into, but one of my concerns, and this just kind of goes back to what I'd said at last month's meeting, is that we've received a lot of public comment with other ideas that are not on that brainstorm document. So I actually started going, I've been reading public comment as it comes in, but I actually started making a list over the weekend of, who has submitted written public comment, on what date and for what purpose. And I think it's really important. I'm not saying it's my job. I was really doing it for my own benefit, but I do think that it's important that that work is done, and that someone, whether it starts in the Ed Finance Committee or, this commission generally, but that there is a discussion about public comment ideas that have surfaced that seem like things that should be included on that brainstorm document, because there are things that have been raised that aren't on that document. So I wouldn't want to limit, what we are asking the Ed Finance Committee to do based on, the universe of ideas that are on that document, without allowing other ideas to come in as well.
Thank you, Jennifer. Oliver, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to echo that point, and we had a little bit of this conversation at our last meeting, and my fear is that it feels like we have heard some suggestions, and on one hand, we're saying that the brainstorm is everything that's on the wall, and some ideas may have merit, others may not have merit, but I worry that by not addressing any of these items that have been submitted, we're sort of making a value judgment. And I will say, there's some ideas out there. I mean, the one I hear most often, we've heard it in public comment, I hear it pretty much every time I go to the dump, is we have too many supervisory unions. And if we just consolidate supervisory unions, all of our problems will go away. I know, and I think most of you know, that's not true. But if we ignore it and we don't actually have the conversation and address those things, we're going to continue to, I think, face criticism that we're not evaluating all the options. So I think part of evaluating all the options is actually for the benefit of the public, helping to kind of dispel, I think, some of the myths out there.
Thanks, Oliver. Mike, and then Zoe.
And I just say, as a member of the Finance Committee, we would love to have everything. So if there's something, Jen, if there's something you have that you think is on there, please share that. We do have one of the ideas on there, and I just pulled it up, is to talk about school size. So I think they're covered, but anything else, we would be happy to add to the list. So if there's something specific, I'd say if you could just let us know or say that, we're happy to add.
Thanks, Mike. I'll interject just really quickly because I wrote my own to-do. I think we can also get to this a little bit during the agenda item about that, but I think it's a pretty easy ask to just cross-reference ideas that have come up in public comment, make sure they are reflected in the brainstorm document, and if they're not, add them. And then I would just say that alongside Oliver's comment of making sure that we aren't elevating anything on it, not on it. We are simply collecting them at that point. So I did just want to say that whether that is an ask of the Finance Committee to do that at the beginning of their next meeting. And, I'm happy to either take what Jennifer has or also come through public comment and supply them with a starting point.
Thank you.
Zoe, and then Jennifer, and then John.
Thanks. I just wanted to follow up on a commitment that I made at the last meeting regarding that list of brainstorm ideas. As we talked about, some of the assumptions underlying those ideas may not be accurate. And so we are working with the team at the agency just to make sure that we can clarify as needed and provide any additional context that may be helpful to further the conversation. So just wanted to make the commission aware that our team at the AOE is following through on that commitment, and we'll be working to provide those updates. Regarding the question around the meeting cadence, I think it could be helpful to, maybe pause on the committee structure at this time until we all get into alignment around the next steps. I think as we were working on finalizing the report, it was clear that sometimes there wasn't as much of a people felt like they weren't as involved in some of the conversation and discussion. And I think just as we're kind of resetting with the new year, that it would be helpful to have the entire commission reviewing and vetting ideas, and then think about how maybe at that point to adjust with resuming the committee structure. And really that recommendation is based on ensuring that there's full transparency and that we're all on the same page before separating into committees.
Thanks, Zoe. Jennifer, and then John.
Thanks. Well, and Megan, you kind of answered what I was going to ask, but I just want to make sure that no one so far has been going through public comment and creating some sort of spreadsheet. Because among other things, I know that by October, we're supposed to have a list of every public comment and our response there too. So I just was wondering if anyone else is doing this work, if there's a plan for doing that work. I'm certainly happy to share what I've done, but I can't, swear that it's the format that the commission would want.
Yeah, just a quick clarifier. There's public comment that we have been collecting and including as part of our minutes, and linking when there is something written. The October deadline next year is formal public comment on the recommendations for next December's report. And that, to your point, will have a much more like the rulemaking process, that sort of collection. We're trying to, so we don't have that formal of a process happening right now in terms of like spreadsheet with, comments analyzed or anything like that. It is collected. It is part of the public record right now, but no other sort of analysis of it, at least in the way that it would be for rulemaking. But and I would offer that part of what we want is for actually our communication and engagement consultant would help us understand, because the goal of public comment is not just to inform our work, it's also to push it back out to the public writ large, to focus groups, to more specific entities where appropriate. And I think we're going to get some support with that. So right now it is collected, it is part of the public record, and it informs, agenda planning and our discussions. It is not analyzed the way it will be. And in some ways that will end up being they're not separate. The work is connected, but that will be its own process of public comment collection. Right now, this is public comment related to our meetings and work.
All right. Thanks.
Sorry, John, I skipped in front of you. Go ahead.
Nope. That's fine. Thanks, Megan. I think that explanation was important. And it's just to sort of piggyback what other people have said. I do think it's important that we analyze the public comments and contributions that have been made from the public so far. I don't, know what that exact process is, whether that's, somebody that takes that on, or whether our, engagement committee takes that on, or we wait until we have the consultant on board. But I do think looking for themes and threads that we should be attentive to, I think is important. And I think incorporating those ideas that may not be currently incorporated into some of our considerations, I think is worthy of our time and effort. Right now, I guess I'm a little confused because I know we're jumping around a little bit because we're kind of like looking at our subcommittee report, but we're also talking about the brainstorming document. And I have some things in particular about the brainstorming document, but I don't know if some people have already jumped in on that. Do we want to continue that now, or do we want to table that? I'm happy to do it either way, to wait or to add those things at this point.
Thanks, John. That's a good prompt. I think let's wait to come back to specific items on the work plan document. I think we're slightly astray, but sort of on topic. I think the goal was to try to convey to this group and hear from this group, just sort of acknowledging we created a structure, an operating structure that included these 3 subcommittees. We have charges for those committees, and we're acknowledging that those structures and the charges of those committees may need to change as we update our work plan. Zoe, I think in terms of pausing them, I think that's a good question for the steering group to kind of consider next week. There's not a lot scheduled, and I would also point out, to the extent that this impacts some, our slotted day for subcommittees is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which may just by itself schedule-wise not work. So we may effectively be paused. I will let the steering group make that decision. But that's kind of why we're talking. And the Ed Finance Subcommittee is an interesting one. It is required in the law, but in the law, it's specific to the preliminary report. And so the question that group was asking itself and asking the steering group to answer is, does the commission desire to continue to use that as a structure? I think that's an open question, is what the steering group had sort of acknowledged. So this is an agenda item without a lot of concreteness to it, other than surfacing issues, which I think that we've done well. Is there anything else related to those, to sort of the committee structure portion of this before we move on? And I think we'll end up with 2 presentations and then we're coming back to a discussion. Peter, go ahead.
This is probably for later, but when we have the steering committee meeting, but I think certainly the
Thank you. Okay. All right. I think that we are, just apologies in advance, I have to wave at my light so it stays on. I think we are moving on, Zoe, to, I'm looking at you, it may not be you giving it, but foundation formula presentation. And just to kind of reiterate from the steering group, this is something that we know is going to be a topic. It's also, at least a version of this was a presentation that the Finance Subcommittee received, and it seemed instructive to have the full commission. So that's the purpose for it being on the agenda. And Zoe, I will turn to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As background, the agency produced the Vermont Education Funding Report a couple of months ago, where we described our current education funding system and compared the Vermont funding system to other states. And as part of that follow-up, we began to explore and learn more about the foundation formula. So in that report, we'd indicated that 48 other states implement a version of a foundation formula. And with the intent of thinking about approaches that build more predictability, transparency, and also support quality, this was an exploration that we pursued with the Education Finance Subcommittee. What we'll walk through is going to be evolution of the foundation formula over the last couple of decades to really a student-centered funding approach. Our consultants, APA Consulting, provided this presentation to the Education Finance Subcommittee, and they asked that we also bring this to the full commission to build background knowledge around this approach and how other states implement this model. There are several considerations relative to equity that we had further conversation around with the Education Finance Subcommittee. And with that, I will turn it over to Justin Silverstein at APA Consulting to walk us through the slides.
Thank you all for the opportunity. Hopefully everyone can see the slides. I think the biggest shift for those of you who have seen this presentation before is that we are, and the Secretary kind of mentioned this, moving to trying to start to talk about a student-centered formula. There are a couple reasons for that. One, the Education Commission of the States, which is a national organization that really tracks a lot of education policy, that is the name they've shifted to using for what has historically been called foundation formulas. And two, and I think probably more importantly, just for the Vermont context, is I think the term of foundation formula has some real history in the state and has some meaning that isn't the meaning that we think of, we being kind of school finance experts from around the country when we talk about a student-centered or foundation formula. So I'll get a little bit more into that and why that is here in a minute. So I'm going to be trying to refer to this as student-centered formula. It's what a lot of states who've created new formulas are calling it. They call it a pupil-centered formula or a student-centered formula. I'm sure I will mess up once or twice throughout the presentation. Again, same concept, just a kind of a more modernized name. Okay. And so as we get going, I want to start with just a couple school finance terms that I might use and just define them here. So if they come up again, you'll kind of know what I mean as I'm talking about them. And so there's equity is an overarching term that's really been around in school finance since the 60s as states started to do more and more school funding systems. And there's three real concepts with equity. The first is what we call horizontal equity. So really think of it just that way. Districts or students who have similar circumstances are expected to be treated the same. So horizontal equity. Vertical equity probably is the more important concept in school finance over the past 25 to 30 years. And really what that means is that districts or students with higher needs require and should be provided additional resources. And so what folks generally agree on in school finance is there are certain students or certain district circumstances that cause a difference in resource need, and that any sort of state formula should adjust for those needs. And then there's taxpayer equity. And taxpayer equity really is focused on that a taxpayer with similar effort should expect to be able to participate and generate similar resources in the system. And so just because you're a taxpayer from a lower property wealth community versus a higher property wealth community, your level of effort shouldn't dictate the resources available in your community. And that leads pretty directly into the next concept, which is fiscal neutrality. And that really at the very base is where a student lives shouldn't determine the resources available to that student. So we want to have a disconnect between the wealth of communities and the resources available to students. If you don't do that, you have some issues, and that comes up all across the country over the past couple decades in different lawsuits. And then the last piece is adequacy. And this is really a concept that started up in the mid 90s as standards-based reform came about. So states started to set the expectations of what students should learn. They then created tests to measure how well that was happening. They created accountability systems to hold schools, at some points even teachers and districts accountable for performance. And so there was just this basic question of, well, do we know what it would cost to meet state expectations? And that's where adequacy came about. It really is trying to identify the level of resources needed to ensure all students can meet state standards or expectations. Okay, and so then I'm going to turn to the components of a funding formula. And this slide really, is why I've started to use that student-centered formula approach in Vermont. Because I think when folks in Vermont think about a foundation formula, they think about both parts of a funding formula. And we really think about them separately. There's two parts of a funding formula, or a finance system, really. And the first is identifying the amount of resources needed for each district in the state through a specific formula, through a specific approach. And so that would include any adjustments for student or district characteristics. And the second piece, once that's identified, is to determine how much a state or local district pays. Now, of course, in Vermont, and we'll talk about the Vermont context, that state-local split isn't quite as important. It's not the same as other states. But in most states, you first run a formula, you determine what's needed, and then you figure out who's paying for it second. And foundation formulas, which we're going to refer to as student formulas, really only do the first thing. They are really only there to determine what are the resources needed based on student and district characteristics. Then every state really thinks about how that's paid for a little differently. And so it's not really part of that student-centered formula as a concept. In Vermont, of course, these are much more combined because there really is no clear step one. There is not a system to say what does every district need? What are the differences for student characteristics at an actual resource level? It's all about tax capacity. And what doesn't happen is to say that if I am an EL student and Zoe is an EL student and we're in two different districts across the state, most states would say both of those students should have this equal level of resource. That's really that first part of a formula. Vermont system doesn't do that. It's all about tax capacity. And there is no real guarantee that students would have similar resources if they have similar characteristics. So why have states come about to changing their formulas? The first is really providing similar educational opportunity for all students. So getting back to really ensuring that students have similar resources if they have similar needs and they're sitting in similar districts. They want those formulas to be more student-centric by targeting additional funding for certain groups. That tends to be your free reduced price lunch or economically disadvantaged students, your English language learners. Some states include special education in the formula. Some keep it outside the formula, more like Vermont does. And then a number of states have really gone to wanting to also have a percentage of dollars that are generated based on student characteristics actually follow that student to their school. So they are determining here's how much additional funding would follow an economically disadvantaged student, and we expect, let's say, 75% of that to actually go to their school. And then states are also trying to adjust for those district cost drivers outside of district control. That tends to be size and cost of living differences. So pulling from that Education Commission of the States analysis of how states run their different funding systems, 36 run a student-centered formula. Regionally, New Hampshire, New York, and Connecticut all run those systems. I would say New Hampshire, if you take a look at their formula, they tend to have a very low, what we call base amount. We'll get more into that. and then adjust. They have a lot of additional local revenues outside of their formula that come in. They've been known over time as probably the least equitable formula in the country. Connecticut has a pretty complex formula, actually, and there's some work being done on that. And New York's formula is, I think, up for some changes. Then some other states who've recently gone to student-centered formulas include Tennessee, Nevada, and Maryland. There are 9 states who use what we call a resource-based model. That is really where it's a state is literally saying, well, if you have, for every 25 students, we're going to give you a teacher. And for every 250 students, we're going to give you a counselor, and so on and so forth. So they actually derive the amount of funding by a very specific set of personnel-based formulas. There are 4 states who use a hybrid approach that includes Massachusetts and Maine. And then you all are one of 2 others. And those 2 others, it's Vermont and Wisconsin. Both of those are much more tax-based systems versus student-centered formulas. And I think I see a question if we want to do that throughout.
I was actually just going to ask you that, Justin. I should have asked you in the beginning. Do you want me to kind of field I can monitor the.
I would love to do questions throughout. That way I'm not missing something.
Perfect. Jeff, go ahead.
So, hi, Justin. Jeff Vannon from Vermont NEA. Thanks for this presentation. I think I saw it previously, but I wasn't in the meeting, so I was just watching. But my question then remains, I don't think it was asked or answered previously, but Vermont has a unique constitutional construct that I'm unaware of in any other state. So my question generally is are you aware of any other state that has a similar constitutional provision as we do under Article 68, that it makes a state mandate, if you will, to provide education?
No, I think you all are unique in that sense. There are a lot of states who are under court order around their school finance system, so that in itself is not unique. I think the taxpayer focus of the Brigham and that decision is slightly different. I don't think a foundation formula is out of alignment with, or a student-centered formula with, that decision. But again, that's because it's that second piece of the work, really the taxpayer and who pays is really the focus, I believe, of kind of your requirements.
Right. Okay. Thanks. I was just curious about other states, but
no, absolutely.
You got it.
Okay. So the next slide really just looks at what are the different components of a student-centered formula, kind of on average in states, and every state's going to look a little different. I think the key piece here is that the majority of funding that's coming through most state systems is the base funding that you see there on the left. Base funding is really an amount of dollars per pupil that any student or family should expect to be available to their kid sitting in any district who doesn't have special circumstances, for any student who doesn't have special needs. Then on top of that, you start to adjust for student needs. And again, that's usually economically disadvantaged students, special education students, if in the formula, and English language learners. You might also look at gifted and talented. You might have adjustments for different grade spans, things like that. And then those district weights or district adjustments tend to, again, be mostly size and cost of living adjustments. Then that is kind of the formula, the main formula. In most states, it's driving 80–90% of funding. And then outside of that, of course, you have federal funding. Most federal funds are targeted towards special, to students with specific needs. So a lot of Title I and your special education funding. You have categorical and grant funding, usually state categorical and grant funding. Again, this is a place where you might see special education funding. And then you have what we call local option funding. And that local option funding tends to be those dollars that are allowed to be generated by districts outside of the state's formula through some sort of local revenue generation. I think we saw another question.
Yeah, thanks. And this may be getting too far in the weeds, but there's often a conversation about weights and categorical aid, federal categorical aid, like Title I, for example, and if states make adjustments for that.
Yeah, so you have the supplement and supplant issue with the feds. So you legally cannot take into consideration, and I'm going to say this like I totally know it, but we have Amanda Brown from my team who's on here, who's kind of an expert in this area. States, in theory, cannot take into consideration the funding going to specific districts for, let's say, Title I or special education as they make their decisions on how they would fund those districts. We have worked with states at the 30,000 foot level to say, here's what we think is the total amount of funding needed, let's say for economically disadvantaged students. And we know there's Title I funding and you can make a statewide decision, but you can't do it one-to-one, right? You couldn't say, well, we think it costs 100% more to serve special education students. 30% of that's coming into Burlington from the Fed, so we'll pay 70%. That would be supplanting. Okay. So digging a little bit into the details of kind of those boxes on the screen, a student-centered formula is going to start again with that base amount, which we have already talked about. That base amount is then going to be what the weights or adjustments are applied to, and then also what those adjustments for cost of living or district size are applied to. And so what's really key in any state is that you are creating all the adjustments needed for that state's context. And so if you have, I happen to live in Colorado, we're kind of a fun example because we have districts as small as 13 or 14 kids, districts as small as 13 or 14 kids, and 2 districts that are 90,000. Right, so you can imagine as the state designs its student-centered formula, which it has, you need a lot of adjustment for size and rurality, right? That's part of what this state has to do. And so every state student-centered formula is slightly different based on those unique characteristics of the state. But on average, those adjustments for like economically disadvantaged students or English learners in special education tend to be kind of within a range, state to state. As you then, again, the student-centered formula itself is saying how much needs to be available in each district. Then each state is making a determination of who pays for it. Again, in Vermont, and based on this kind of what's in place there, those dollars really need to be statewide dollars. In most states, what you actually have is what we call an equalization approach, where the state effectively is saying, we expect the same tax effort in every community. In low wealth communities, that means the state's they're going to raise less of the dollars as a percentage, and the state's going to pay more. And in high wealth communities, just the opposite is going to happen. That effectively, is going on kind of under the hood of the Vermont system, even in today's form. But it's a little bit more explicitly done in these equalization formulas. So again, the Vermont context. As a state, you have a history, even before Act 2127, of having student-centered formula adjustments. Again, those adjustments really are about tax capacity. They are not a guarantee or a funding target for each student specifically, so you don't have the same level of funding for like students place to place, but you have kind of a history with those adjustments. And then again, and that's really because the weights that you have in your system over time aren't applied to a base amount. They exist for tax capacity, not for funding targets. We talked about this a couple times, fully state-funded system. The state's formula does provide taxpayer equity by adjusting those local tax rates to, based on kind of the per weighted pupil spending decisions that are made locally. And it does allow for variation in spending through local budget decisions. Again, those budget decisions are somewhat unrelated to target amounts of spending for specific student need. And so as we think about implementing a student-centered formula in Vermont, we think, again, having some, taking a look at the Act 127 weights and understanding the history of the weights is important. But we also think it's more important that if you need to set a base, and when you set a base, you should then go back and look at the weights in that context. Currently, the weights don't have kind of the same meaning they have in most other states. So the base really is that key factor in an overall student-centered formula. There's a number of approaches that have been available to develop a base. In a lot of states, probably not surprising, it really is about how many dollars are available. And so the state really is just trying to think through, here's how many dollars we have available. But what is true is that these adequacy approaches have been developed. Your state has actually had one of those adequacy approaches run recently through the PICUS audit report and an evidence-based report. And so those adequacy studies really try to determine the resources needed, and they do it in one of two ways. The evidence-based approach and what we call the professional judgment approach do it through an input-based kind of concept. And so what you do there is you develop a set of prototype or hypothetical schools and districts. You look at the research, or you talk to educators in the state, and you determine, what are the people you need in the school. So what would the student teacher ratios be? We talked a little bit we heard about that earlier today. Would you have a principal in a school? Would you have an assistant principal in a school? What kind of counselors would you like to have? What type of wraparound services do you need to have in the school? So you build up schools and districts from that resource level. The other approach, and actually where some of your weights from 127 were derived, are these output-based approaches. Most specifically in Vermont, there was a cost function approach used, very data-driven. It looks at relationships using regression analysis. The other output approach is called the Successful School Districts approach. It's a very base per pupil amount approach driven, and what it does is it identifies those districts who are performing at a higher level than other districts in the state, either an absolute level or growth, and it looks at how much they spent to determine what a base funding amount should be. We know that the state currently, allows for variation in local spending through those budget decisions. If you have a foundation or a student-centered formula, there's going to be, an absolute amount set by the state as a targeted amount of funding for every district based on their student and district characteristics. There's always a question then, should districts then also be able to go above that? And if that were to happen, we think it's really important to ensure that there's some taxpayer equity through some equalization of basically dollar raising capacity. And then also the question of, would you want to cap how much could be raised locally above the state's target through the student-centered formula? All of this really falls under and really thinking about any changes that would happen, how they would be reflected on Brigham. So I just threw a ton at you. We got some questions, but I'd love more. Happy to clarify and to go from there.
Jay, go ahead. I can kind of field the hands, then you can just answer.
Okay, so just some clarification first. I have a lot of concerns about the Brigham piece and local options above and beyond and how that would be done in a fair way. But putting that aside for a minute, so we've got the weights from 127. So if theoretically, if we were to say X equals 1.0 FTE student, the average student we're saying for elementary is X, and let's say X is whatever number, doesn't matter what number it is, then would we simply say, okay, high school students are an additional 0.25 or whatever it is we came up with, I don't have it in front of me. Middle school students are additional 0.27, ELL students are additional, and then you'd add those things up, and whatever that number is, okay, school district, this is the amount of money that you would have for your operating budget. You decide who to hire for personnel, how to go about that, but this is the money that you have, with the possibility that there might be obviously some spending above that based on, again, the local option piece, which I really am concerned about. But that's essentially how this would work.
Yes. And I think, again, a couple things. You could clearly right now kind of pick a base number for kind of just a theory of action test, and you could run your system out the other way with the current weights. I think a couple important things.
$1,000, just because it's an easy number to work with, and you just threw the number out there, you could do the math and see, okay, this is how it would work.
Yeah, those long-term weighted ADM that you have in your system effectively would do that. And it is more transparent in the newest system, where there used to be the equalization before, right? You had 83,000 kids, it got ramped up by some number and then equalized back down. The new approach is very transparent there. I think, and we mentioned it here, one of the things that we would really press on is that the base is the most important thing in the whole system, right? Knowing what that means and it having meaning is really important. It's great that you have the Pike-Assad report out there. We know the pushback on it and some of the flaws in that report and kind of it not having the full Vermont context. But I think there's ways to think it through. And with that, once you set the base, I think you would want to reevaluate the weights, especially on your kind of EL and at-risk weights, because right now, right, they are a capacity piece, but then you would have a number, right? If let's say it was 10,000, to your point, you would take 10,000 and then you would add $24,900 per every EL student in the system. under the current construct. And so each of those students would be about 34,900, I think. So, right, really understanding, is that best practice? Is that the real resource need? I think is the next step. But you're absolutely right. The basic concept is built into your current system. It's just that you don't have a base number to apply it to right now.
And so then with this, to continue along this vein, and then I'll be quiet. So with this model, this concept, essentially the state would be essentially setting a budget for a school district and saying, any town school district, this is what you have to spend. There'd be no more going to the voters. There'd be no more voters saying, we want to raise more than what's in the budget or whatever. It would be a set number, and what the voters would have say in perhaps would be on the local level, what programs we want to have in our school for that amount of money. Is that kind of the idea?
I think I would agree that the majority of funding would be set through the formula. So the available dollars for every district would be set through the formula, and as kind of the feature of the system, right? Basically saying that if you have 5% of your students who are EL and the district next to you has 10% of their students who are EL, English learners, right? And you both have the same food or spice lunch count and you're about the same size, we would expect the district with 10% of their students versus 5% to probably need more overall resources. I think what you see under the hood right now is that districts who have higher need are not necessarily taking advantage of the higher capacity. And so you likely have many of your higher need students with lower dollars per student than your lower need communities. So yes, that would be true.
We know that's happening. You're absolutely right. That is occurring. We do know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the second part of your question, if you were allowing that additional local control, that could be something that you're going to your voter community to say, here's what we're going to receive from the state. Would we like to supplement that with additional funding? And then to your second point, I think it does open the possibility for a shift from just local communities voting on the funding that's available in the budget to then thinking more about how are dollars being used. So I think there's still avenues for that local engagement in the budgeting process.
And again, my big concern with that, and I totally, thanks, Amanda, right?
Yep.
Thanks, Amanda. And then I'll be quiet. I'm sorry, I'm into the fiscal stuff a little bit. My big concern with that whole piece is, how do we equalize that as a state to be consistent with our Constitution and the Brigham decision? And what I would worry about would be the legislature and the General Assembly, and maybe not this one, maybe some down the road. We're in financial crisis, so we're just going to make less money available for schools. And then communities with more means go out and say, well, we're going to raise an extra $4,000 per kid. And other districts can't do that because their communities are poorer. And we've already got enough inequities in our system. I know we pride ourselves on trying not to have inequities, but we have a lot of them. Yep. To the point you just made before about having tax capacity, but not using it is a great example of that. So that, I don't have an answer for that. I don't know if you have an answer for that, but that is a worry that I have on top of this.
Yep.
Thanks, Jay.
I think if I could
Peter,
just
go ahead. No, go ahead, Zoe, if you're jumping in.
I was just going to jump in. I mean, I think that as Vermont contemplates this option, there would need to be compliance with the Brigham decision. And I think also what might be helpful is for Justin and Amanda to give some more context around how states make decisions about what is factored into that base amount. And also, as we talk about that local revenue generation, what the intention of that. So this is shifting to thinking about that as just extra, right? And so if you could kind of talk through, how to think about a base, weights, and the local would be helpful, because it's very different than our current context.
And Justin, as you do that, if you're using slides, by all means, keep them up. But if not, can you stop sharing, just because it's harder to see each other?
Yeah,
perfect.
Thank you. I meant to say that too. And I think there's a really important point here as you're explaining this, that our current system is about taxpayer capacity but we know in actuality that there's great variability in spending per pupil. And so a student-centered funding formula is designed to ensure that a student that has the same needs is guaranteed to get that same amount of service and support.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can quickly talk about it, and there was in some of the slides, like, as you develop the base, what's really nice about those input-based approaches, and that's what you have from that Pikus-Auden report, is that it very explicitly talks about, at a school of X size, and admittedly in the Pikus-Auden report, it's 450 students per every elementary and middle school, and we know that's larger than most Vermont schools and 600 in high school. But it says really explicitly, right? Like, there's going to be a counselor for every 250 students at a high school or a middle school. You're going to have a interventionist for every 200 kids, right? An interventionist at every school. The development of the base has some meaning, and it either in the input case has meaning on these are the people that you would expect to be able to staff. Now, again, local communities might staff differently, but it's the basis of what you would have. In an output approach, it is, this is the amount we think is needed to get certain levels of performance, right? So you want it to have meaning, ideally beyond, well, we have X amount to spend. And as you pointed out, like, you could see that in the future, right? That can happen in any state, and states do need to have flexibility when they have tough times financially. There are a lot of states, though, who start this whole thing with just here's how much we have to spend. And that means that base never has meaning, right? If you at least have meaning in the first iteration, you can tie back to if things aren't keeping up, let's say, with inflation, and say, okay, where are we behind? If you just start with the concept of, well, here's how much we have, then kind of the underlying piece never has that meaning. So I think that becomes problematic. And then the weights, similarly, really need to be out, like, what are the services needed for students in each of those categories? And that's why it's so important to know your base, because if your base is, let's make it up, we were talking about 10,000. Well, if it's 5,000 and you need a certain set of resources for your free reduced price lunch students, well, their weight would now have to be 2 times as high as it would be at 10,000, right? The percentage above in weights isn't actually as important as the total dollar generation and resource generation when you set up the first time.
And just adding to the second part of your question, Zoe, I think was within that construct, the base and the weights is really representing what resources are needed to provide that high quality education to all students. So it should be the vast majority of your dollars. The local control should be for those extras. You've already established through your base and weights that you've provided the amount of funding that every school and district should have to provide the education you want to see for students. So again, that local extra piece should just be like, we keep calling it the whipped cream. We don't have like a good example of how to describe it otherwise, but that little bit of extra, the rest of what's really needed for students should be coming through that for foundation, base, and weights.
Thanks. Elizabeth and then Oliver.
I'm just curious. I know that in the formula and one of the slides showing the different layers of, talking about the base, and then the adjusted weights are for, student needs. And then there's adjustments for districts. Is that the area where, funding formula like this would deal with the differences in facilities? Vermont is in a situation where a lot of our school districts, in some cases, they may have lower spending per pupil, but they also might have ailing buildings that have deferred maintenance. And then there's other places where they don't have that. Maybe they've been able to pass a bond with their community and they've been able to upgrade their facilities. And it's all in varying states of situations. And we're not all starting on that even playing field, even when we talk about our buildings and the structures themselves.
So I would say most states do not have a specific kind of facilities adjustment for, to your point, like differences in deferred maintenance over time. I think that is something that we are very hyper aware of in the conversation in the context in Vermont, the somewhat recent history of just a real lack of facilities funding over time. And we think it's something that has to be dealt with kind of in conjunction as this goes forward. Ideally, your base amount doesn't keep that in, right? To your point, because you're trying not to, you're trying to have what's ongoing cost. We totally recognize that there has to be some thought around how do you get facilities up, or else the base amount will be fine for one district and it won't cover the operation and maintenance cost for another. And so we see that it's not historically a district adjustment, but it is something the state needs to be coming in and thinking about as they move. If you go with the new formula or not, right? It is an ongoing concern, district to district.
Oliver and then Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. This is a very helpful presentation. So the thing that comes to my mind is Vermont's history with various foundation formula. And, the history, there have been at least 3 of them, starting from, 1969. And the history has always been that sort of inflation and budgetary, as Jay alluded to, budgetary constraints at a state level have sort of constrained the state's share, and ultimately the local share, what was meant to be the quote unquote extra or the whipped cream, sort of, really starts becoming a bigger share of what really should be the base. So what are you seeing in other states? What mechanisms are in place to, prevent that from playing out as it has historically in Vermont?
Yeah. So there's a couple different ways you can do it. And again, the Vermont context makes this really neat, but I'll talk about like in a Maryland who just put in the new system, they legislatively have it as a 50-50 split, right? So they've already determined what will be state and local every year for every formula, right? So it's explicit. Now, again, that isn't possible in Vermont, but I'm just like, there are mechanisms where you make your legislation very explicit. There are states like Colorado where the increase in the base is actually constitutionally mandated. And so that's in the Constitution. You have to have the base increased by at least inflation every year. I will just fully transparency. What happens then when there's budget constraints is they cut the weights, right? So, every state has to be able to think at some level about the your budget considerations. And so there's no perfect solution, but I think getting as explicit as possible. We're reviewing some of this language actually as part of the work. So Mississippi, I know everyone wants to be Mississippi. I know no one wants to be Mississippi in school funding, but they have put in a new system and they are very explicit to what they want to tie their increases to as far as a mechanism, with the recognition it might not happen every year. But what that allows is for everyone to know how far behind the state funding is, right? If you know what it should increase each year, even if the state can't, you know what the gap is, right? So there's a couple different ways to think about that. We work with policymakers all over the country. Generally, people want to have one set budget stability, of course, and schools know that they have growth and cost, and you need to keep up with that too. It's a really tough balance.
Thanks, Mike, and then John.
Thanks, Justin. Really helpful report. And I have a couple of questions. One is somewhat ties into Oliver's question about the different systems we've had. Transitioning to Act 127 last year, we know there's a number of school districts that spend less than what the Act 127 weights say they should. So, and part of that's Vermont's one of a handful of states that has voter approval of budgets. So what's the interplay between that foundation formula and what you would see, and maybe this is a legislative question, but what you would see as the voters' role in approving that base amount?
And that's where I think this is really a question of a larger policy shift. Because I think you said something, and I could just be wrong in the system, that there are districts who spend below their kind of 127 target. I don't think there is actually formulaically a 127 target, right? There is nothing because there is no base. There is, so correct. I think you're 100% right that there are districts who spend below the capacity we think they have, right? They have more capacity perhaps than they went out to get, and that's a local decision that's happening. And we think a lot of that is in higher need places versus lower need places. Not perfectly aligned, but if you look at current spending. But it would likely take, and I'm going to say this, and Zoe and Amanda tell me just where I'm wrong, a shift in thinking about who's voting and controlling what to have a foundation formula, because as you get more and more local choice, you tend to get more and more student inequity. And I know Brigham is more on a taxpayer side, but your current system, I think, drives more student inequity than folks really think about.
Yep.
Because those local budget decisions allow for folks to simply say, we want to pay less, even though we have higher capacity, and thus our higher need community isn't going to have the resources they need. And so this is hopefully fixing both, or not having to fix the one, but keeping the student equity picture and that student-centric formula in a way that still keeps taxpayer equity as best we can.
Yeah, and
Thank
just
you. You
really
rephrased it in a
naming,
better way. My other question was, what have you seen in states that have transitioned to this? What does that transition look like? Does it happen over a period of time? Can you talk through that a little bit?
Yeah, so I know this is going to shock everyone. The best time to make a transition is when you have a ton of new money and you just say, hey, look, we're going to run a new formula and everyone gets more. What some states do, what a lot of states have done, is you run a multi-year hold harmless. And so you start to phase in the new dollars as you ensure that folks aren't really losing funding over time, and funding being kind of more on a per pupil basis, not total funding ideally. Pennsylvania did this where they made it 5% of the formula and then 10% of the formula. I will say that was a total mess, and they ended up being sued and they lost. So there's a couple ways to transition. I think just from history, the faster you do it, the better. The more you can support districts who might be kind of the winner and loser side. On the loser side, the better. But you want to get it done. You want folks to have transparency and predictability of when it's going to happen, right? So you probably don't want to do it tomorrow. But folks need to know, here's what's coming. Here's how we're going to count kids. Here's what you would be expected to fund. Here's what it might look like for you, and give a glide path to get there over a couple of years.
Thanks. John, and then Jennifer. Oh, maybe just John.
Thanks, Megan. I have two questions. First question is, can you talk a little bit about how some states balance weighting with categorical aid? In terms of the difference in utilizing those approaches to target the resources going specifically to student needs, as opposed to, in a way, even though weighting is applied based on need, it's still creating increased capacity. It doesn't necessarily mean it's applied. The second question is, are there any states out there that essentially don't have a local option, that they're saying, this is what you get? This is the base amount, the weighting, and the categorical aid, your federal funds and all of that, but there is no local option at all. Just curious if there's any models like that. So those are the two questions.
So your first question, it puts you right on the cutting edge of the school finance conversation. And I think you're absolutely right. Historically, states have used categorical funding. And so when we say categorical funding, what we mean is targeted funding that is 100% state dollars, right? There is no local match. And often it is for specific student groups. And I think, John, just to your point, it's because we want to fund special ed. We want to make sure all dollars go to special education students. So here are dollars for special ed. You better track those dollars in your accounting system. And if we give you 100 million, we expect to see 100 million spent on special ed. As we all know, it'll be 100 million times some huge amount, because we never have enough special education funding in the systems across the country. What has shifted is that states like Maryland and Nevada have actually gone more back to weighting, but within their weighting constructs, they have created charts of accounts that track those weighted dollars like categorical dollars. And so they effectively say, we expect, and for Maryland, it's 75% of every, what they call comp ed, but that's economically disadvantaged funding, it's 75% of, and 75% of EL funding to follow a student to their school. So it kind of acts like categorical funding, but it allows the state to keep capturing that local capacity, where that's the problem with categorical funding, right? Every time it's fully state funded, really wealthier communities kind of get a benefit from that because they don't have to raise additional, they don't have to have their local capacity tapped. So that's really what states have shifted a little bit to, is because we have much more robust charts of accounts today, and we can really track both revenue side and spending side, you can basically have a categorical funding concept within a weighted student-centric formula. The second piece is great, other than we've only been looking at the other side of this, is how many states actually allow for the spending above and how much. I'll need to go back and look. I am sure at some point that existed. I can't think of any state today that basically says, here's our formula, here's your categorical, and there's nothing else local, it likely exists. I just don't know it off the top of my head, but we'll take a look.
I'm thinking off the top of my head, Wyoming, they're a full recapture state.
That's true.
So I don't think they allow any local for operating. They may allow it for like bonds and capital construction. That I don't know off the top of my head, but they are 100% all dollars go to the state to be redistributed.
And they are also a state who's under court order through their Campbell decision, and they use the evidence base as their basis for their whole funding formula.
Peter, and then I put myself in the queue.
Thanks. You know, obviously, as you keep saying, that base amount is really the key thing. And it's often, you know, based on adequacy and all of that. What are the different methods that states are using to arrive at that number?
So I'm going to put the slides back up real quick because I went.
Yeah, I saw those are sort of in general, but I'm like, more specifically, are they hiring academics to come up with a number? Are they using PICUS? Just be very interesting to know specifically.
Yeah, so it depends. So in kind of recent changes, Tennessee simply did it based, they had some new money they wanted to put in the system. They had a construct they liked. They didn't do any kind of study of what the dollar should be. They simply went with, here's how much we have. And if you kind of put the math equation together, here's how much that base would be. So that's kind of the least adequacy focused approach you can have. But again, a really good intent of a new, more student-centric formula. In Maryland, they actually had a commission, you guys, who went in and they looked at what they wanted their school, they wanted K-12 education to look like. And some of that was they wanted new career ladders and they wanted more robust CTE and a bunch of other things. And they took an initial adequacy study that used both evidence-based professional judgment. And they built on that to say, this is actually what we want our system to look at. And they are phasing in that new base as the new requirements come in their system. So I think it's in like 2029, you have to have a full new career ladder. And in that year, you'll have more funding in the system to ensure you can have the whole new career ladder. Arkansas and Wyoming really turn to that evidence base each year. They have an evidence base. They tweak it sometimes based on new requirements in the state. They apply new salaries each year. And then that's the funding system. Kind of most broadly, there tends to be 4 or 5 groups around the country who will run 1 or 2 or 3 of these approaches for a state to kind of triangulate what that base should be. I would say all of us have some academic background. Most of us, are running smaller consulting firms to do that, but it's all based on the kind of the academic research.
And just to name one more example, Nevada would be one that has used the professional judgment approaches, their kind of optimal funding target. And then they used that successful schools approach. We supported their Department of Ed to run that figure as their starting point. So there's also different ways that folks use the different approaches to represent different pieces of what they're hoping to accomplish.
Thanks, Justin. And Amanda, I'm actually, it's less of a question so much as revoicing something that I think you've said that is very much in alignment with how this commission's doing its work. And so I want to revoice it to make sure that that I'm hearing it the same way. You talked a little bit about, kind of fixing both the equity of funding part, which is what we have been focusing on with what our students actually receiving. And I just want to sort of say again, this is one of the reasons why this commission is identifying the quality or delivery system and governance, which is decision making about that delivery system, as key components, because we're sort of working on the assumption that we can't just fix any one part of it because one of the other legs will fall off the stool. And I think that I heard that in your presentation, and I just want to make sure that I didn't make a correlation because I wanted to hear it, but that sticks out for me quite a bit. Even in this conversation about what is adequate and all of that, there is still a decision-making and delivery system component, even if we were to create the most perfect formula.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. I think you can redesign any formula and send out dollars differently. And if folks aren't if you don't have the right things happening underneath the hood and dollars going to kids, right, there's a disconnect between the policy change you made over here and what students and families are seeing in their actual community. So yes, I think you're absolutely right.
I would just say, going back to that.
You muted yourself, Amanda.
Sorry. I was going to say, so Nevada is an example of a state that, used the approaches to identify where they want to go. Then they also have a commission on school funding that's been operating since implementation to review implementation of the formula, to Justin's point, to see if it's doing the things they expect it to and making modifications to that. So it's another really interesting example.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Thank you. So I had my hand up and then Mike asked my question about transitions. So, and let me just back up and say thank you both for giving this presentation, because I think it has been really helpful to sort of think about what this would look like in practice. And I guess maybe that's where I'm trying to envision, if we go down this road, what does that look like? So I guess fundamentally, are we still raising money to fund this student-centered formula through property taxes?
So I cannot make any policy decisions. Your legislature gets to do all of that. Some of you get to do that personally. But yes, I think when we were, if we're to model this out, we would be trying to, you could go in and basically say, what are the non-property tax revenues currently available for the ed fund? And then you would have a remainder, and you could calculate what the kind of common raise would need to be across the state for, for every some per pupil amount of taxable value. Again, there are few states, I'll just say this, who don't use property tax in some way to fund their schools. And you do that because one, it's a large basis of dollars. Two, and most importantly, I think it's because it's relatively stable. And I know a lot of us, I think I heard someone early on talk about a 29% increase in their property values. Here in Colorado, that kind of average last year was 40%, right? Like we've seen these increases, but overall, right, it's very steady. They tend to trend up over time, not, unlike income taxes and sales tax that bounce around a lot. So it would be unusual for a state not to use property tax in some way to fund schools.
Okay, well, and that's kind of what I was wondering. And so maybe my next two questions are maybe more for Zoe, because I'm wondering if we're still raising the money through property taxes, and basically, now we've got the state saying this is what we consider to be an adequate amount per child. So, hey, school district, you might have been paying effectively X amount over the past several years, but now we're redistributing in a way that I think makes sense. I'm just trying to figure out how to land this plane, because now maybe this district is getting less money. And we saw last year, districts really, really struggled with how to pass a budget and feeling like they couldn't trim off anything more from their budget. Or the flip side is tax rates have gone up. And I think there are certain portions of the population who feel like they're kind of stuck in their houses. Like they can't necessarily afford their property taxes, but they also can't afford to sell their house because there's nowhere to go. So I think that's an unrelated thought, but I guess it's my other, maybe echoing what Megan just said about how these decisions can't occur in a vacuum because they're all interrelated. And so I think it would be really important for the legislature to think about, if we're creating a new funding formula, what are the off ramps that we're giving to people, or the transitions that we're giving, to people, to school districts? Because I think I can see this period of transition being chaotic if it's not, really adequately planned for.
I'll leave the question around property taxes specifically to Craig. I think from the Agency of Education perspective, we've been exploring student-centered funding as a way to ensure consistent quality and equity across the state, and also thinking about efficiency and effectiveness of the dollars we have. So as we think about the base amount, which we've discussed a lot on this call, it's really thinking intentionally around the assumptions that are built into that base amount. So as Justin mentioned, there's a lot of different ways that states do that. It's a big part of our lens has been, again, educational quality, equity, and maximizing limited dollars. So built into those assumptions are also discussions around scale and discussions around educational delivery and kind of the inputs and opportunities we want all of our students to have. So I would say from that side, there's a lot that's very interesting about this direction. From the actual side of the house of how things are funded, I would leave that to Craig. And I know his team is, recently released a report too on some revisions to the tax side of the house that could be beneficial. Craig, do you want to take that one?
I apologize. I had to step away for a moment, so I don't think I got your full question, Jennifer, about property taxes, but happy to try to answer it.
Well, so I was curious with, if we are changing the formula to a student-centered formula, and I realize like that's a point of conversation, right? Like this is not a done deal, but if we are moving in that direction, and if we are still raising the money that will then be used to determine the amount per student that is the proper amount, if we're still raising that amount through property taxes, it feels like we still kind of have the same size pie and we are redistributing it. So I'm just reflecting on this past spring, how there were a number of school districts who really struggled to pass a budget and felt like they couldn't trim anything more from their budget. So if these districts are now in this transition period with the funding formula and they're getting less money because now they're being told like this is the amount of money that you have to educate your students, I'm sort of anticipating that there might be similar problems where they feel like they can't trim anything more from their budget to be able to pass it. And then my other thought was, let's just say that it works and property taxes go up. I do recognize that there are people in my own town who feel like they can't afford to pay taxes on their house, but there's nowhere for them to go. So I wouldn't want any changes that are made to occur in a vacuum, because I think we need to be aware of the ripple effects that would happen.
Yeah, I mean, there's with the property taxes and education funding, right? There's two ways to make property taxes go down. One is to reduce education spending and the other is to raise other taxes. So there aren't a lot of levers, but take your point to not do things in a vacuum.
Thanks.
So I'm just going to do a quick time check. We've got 3 more questions, and Zoe, I just want to make sure that if we go a little over, do you still have the time you need? We can also eat into the 3 o'clock. Okay. So Elizabeth and then Jay.
This is in kind of correlation to that whole conversation about not making changes in a vacuum. If we were moving in a direction of this kind of funding formula change, I'm curious about kind of just keeping it on the radar that we're also talking about some of those other strategies and changes in school districts and talking about staff size, class size, all of those things still coming into play, because that's how school districts are going to be able to possibly accommodate less money, more money, that kind of situation in their own school district and still meet the needs of students. But also have a little bit of leverage in saying, we need to reduce by 3 staff members because we are not meeting these standards. And so that helps them with their community in conversations and saying, we have to meet this standard. This is the only amount of money we're going to get. But I'm also curious about in states where they're using these kind of funding formulas now, how many of those states, if you know this, are also using some kind of statewide or regional contract for salaries or benefits in any way?
So the states who tend to have what we'd call a statewide salary schedule tend to be, if you go way back on the kind of early slides, those resource based models, and those tend to be southern states. And it's a minimum schedule. And the reason they have them is that when we go in, let's say you're a district of 1,000 students, and we're going to give you 1 counselor for every 200 kids, just making up. So now we have 5 counselors. You're going to go to the state and say, okay, you're funding us for 5 counselors. We might have 6 or 7, but you're funding us for 5. here's all of their education and experience. So you're going to give us this amount of money, because they're literally going to take each of those people and they're going to apply the statewide salary schedule amount to it. What I do think we see in a lot of states who have the rurality that you do, I am hoping, is more like BOCES or educational service agencies who help with getting common kind of contracting, so folks get the better of, right? So in Colorado, we have a lot of this, which is like, if I go to buy an Apple computer and I'm a really small district, I can be guaranteed to get that rate as the same rate as Denver, because our BOCES has gone and said, okay, we're going to kind of piggyback on some of these larger districts to get purchasing power. So I think there's some of those things that can definitely happen. There's less of the common contracts on salary and benefit.
Jay and then Jeff.
I swear I didn't talk to Elizabeth before this meeting. So Justin and Amanda, we've talked about the right amount of dollars going to kids, which I really appreciate. I do think, and I think Elizabeth just alluded to a little bit, there's a big elephant in the room we haven't really discussed much as a commission. I guess my question is centers more around inequities with educator pay, since about 75% of education costs are based on salaries and benefits of employees, working for a district. Is the vast inequity of teacher salaries and even some administrator salaries that we have in Vermont similar in other states? Typically, not all. So we pay teachers more in our more well-resourced districts, and they typically tend to have larger class sizes, but that's not always the case. So I'm just wondering how that variable plays into this, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So two things. I think one, that variation does exist across states. And I think to your point, especially when we get to states who have more rural settings, we often see districts who have made decisions, and I'm just going to say, maybe to have a first and second grade classroom, each with 7 or 8 kids, right? That leads to needing to pay their teachers less, right? That's kind of if they maybe combine that classroom and had a 1-2 classroom, right? That would kind of shift what they could pay. But that range happens across the country. I think a big part of setting the base in Vermont is thinking through, and you can go into the Picus-Auden report, and it's using statewide average salaries as the driver to get to the base cost, which would mean any district who has more, is paying more than that, right? That base cost is going to be a little below what they would need to have that resource allocation that is pointed out in the report. And any district who's paying less than that, right, that's more dollars than they would need. So I think really having the conversation, right, what are the right salary and benefit parameters when you set the base cost is part of, Jay, to your point, really trying to think through, as you set the base, do you have the adequate pay out there? It doesn't change actual contracts. It doesn't change, some of those pieces, but it at least says the dollars are in the base to pay at least X, right? If you have, and the Picus-Auden model is 15-to-1 K through 3. Right. So if you're running 10 kids in every one of your K through 3 classrooms, you wouldn't have enough to pay statewide average salary. But if you're running 15-to-1, you kind of should. Right. And so that's some of the things that is also important to look under the hood when you see the disparities. Are there dramatic differences? And if you pointed out, sometimes you just see, well, they're making different resource decisions on their ratios, which just constrains the ability to pay higher salary. And they could be really rational decisions. I'm not saying they're bad decisions. It's just that's the decisions they're having to make.
Jeff and then Mike.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation for certain. I'd like to just address something you said earlier, Justin, about income taxes being variable. While that may be true for you, right? You're a CEO of an organization. You might have a great year and get a bonus one year and then not have a great year the next year and not get a bonus. It's variable for you as an individual, but overall, income taxes are very stable. And in fact, most state governments, and I believe all, fund the majority, as does Vermont, of their state government with income tax, which is very stable. So variable as to an individual, but not as an overall number. So I think that's actually something important. Property taxes are also variable as to individuals, but stable overall. So the two of them are quite stable in reality. And I think, Craig, the other option you didn't talk about is we are, believe that we got to right size, if you will, and adjust for taxes to make sure that that they're more equitably distributed. So there are some who are paying less than they should, perhaps some who are paying more than they should in comparison. We think that's the third option, and not just increasing or cutting spending, but more equitably distributing the tax burden, the tax obligation. So I think that's the other option here.
Yeah, that doesn't lower property taxes overall. It just changes the composition of who pays.
Well, it would actually, if you did, it would lower the property tax as to most people. It might change it for others, correct? But that's why we've been advocating for the income tax, as you know.
I think I'm going with Mike and then John.
Thank you. And just to go back to the point that Jay was making, and I can't remember who was talking before about salaries and teacher salaries. You talked a little bit about funding the number of teachers with that adequacy amount. What role does cost of living throughout the state play? We have some areas that have a higher cost, lower cost. What have you seen in that respect?
So I'm going to talk about this and watch Amanda flee the screen.
I was like, Justin, do you want me to field this?
Yeah, you should go for it.
So cost of living is a very bit of a tricky minefield in school finance. There's not that many states that use it. I think there's 13 that use some sort of cost of living adjustment, and they vary in terms of whether they use an adjustment for cost of living or cost of staff. There's this idea of kind of a comparative wage index of looking at what does it take to kind of attract and retain staff to a community. And you might see places that have a high cost of living actually have an easier time attracting staff and can pay lower salaries because they're a more attractive place to be, even though they're costly. So there's some different thoughts around that. I think what would be really tricky for Vermont to consider is a lot of the ways that states look at determining what that differential is between communities relies on having really robust data around salaries in different communities. And when you have a pretty small population, it's hard to get that data. You tend to have to lump a lot of communities together to get to what the Census Bureau calls like a PUMA, like a population. I can't remember the exact name of it. But so it's harder to implement those in rural communities without doing a lot of state-specific data collection to figure out what the variance is in communities. So they're a bit tricky to implement. And I will say in something we do see kind of in the Northeast specifically is sometimes states won't adjust for cost of living for all communities, but they do for like, say, communities that border another state that might have really high salaries in that community, or in the DC area, all of the Virginia districts nearby get an adjustment because they have to compete with that market. So there's some different things to think about it. I was just going to say it's a bit of a tricky, complex area. We've spent a lot of time working with states on how to think about that.
Thank you.
John.
So I guess my question may be more for Zoe and Craig. It would appear that this is likely going to be a recommendation from the administration to move in this direction of a foundation formula. Certainly there's been some interest from members of the legislature already. It all depends, right? So if we're looking at the base amount, the weights, categorical aid, local option, what gets plugged into each of those categories there'll be winners and losers, right? As we know with any funding formula, that's going to happen. And so is there modeling that is already starting to take place because of, the timing of all of this and giving the legislature, the opportunity for due process to consider all of these different options? There's going to need to be a very substantial approach on modeling. And so I guess I'm curious if that's been initiated or whether that's being weighted to see what interest there is from the legislature.
So I can field that question. So as you know, in my role in the commission, we've been having all of these conversations. The agency has been publishing a number of reports to help us understand our current education funding system, how it compares, and what are some strategies that we might want to explore. the agency brought on APA Consulting, and we also brought on New Solutions K-12 to help and support our thinking. And so as part of that contract, there's the opportunity to work with both entities to support modeling as we move forward, and also are getting different questions and evaluating different inputs. So that is a capacity that the Agency of Education has already brought on with 2 consulting firms.
I'd also note, John, right, for the legislature, the Joint Fiscal Office does the modeling for policy proposals. And so I'm not sure what's happened on that front, but the administration and Joint Fiscal Office usually work toward consensus estimates. And so I would assume that that same process would happen when if and when the legislature expresses interest in certain parts of the proposal and working out those details.
Thank you.
I would just add, that part of our role with me sitting on the commission is really the agency being a partner in this work, right? And so I think it's been really helpful to be engaging in these conversations with the commission, with the Education Finance Subcommittee. APA has been really involved in being responsive to questions and looking at different data analysis. And so I think that's really helped us in thinking up till this point. And we're, looking forward to the ongoing collaboration as we move forward and exploring what's going to be the right fit for Vermont. And the agency has, as part of our strategic planning process, has adopted the same guiding principles as the commission, which is focusing on improving educational quality, equity, and sustainability. And so certainly looking at all of the different analysis and numbers is important. And APA has been a great partner to us at the agency in being able to improve our data infrastructure and reporting in coordination with many of you in the field of making sure that we can address some of the longstanding data issues to get to a place where modeling can be done in a more sophisticated way.
Thanks, Zoe. Any other questions? We're a little over, but any other questions for Justin and Amanda? Or anyone else? I also sat in on the previous presentation, but I appreciate both of you coming and presenting it here. I think the conversation is really helpful. I think even, John, that question at the end is really relevant to work plan, coordination, not working at cross purposes. And I think it's just something we're going to have to pick up. But this was really helpful. And I think to say it was not a waste of time is an understatement. That it's really, really useful. We are moving on to a little bit of an update from Zoe, but I am wondering, we are virtual and none of us have left our screens. And I wonder if it would be helpful for us to take about a 10-minute break. It does push everything back a little bit. Zoe, is that okay? And are folks okay with that?
I'll provide content for whatever time frame I have available. So just let me know how much time do you want me to spend on this next item?
I mean, it's 15 minutes in the agenda, and I think we can keep it to that. And then it just shortens our work plan discussion, which I think is okay because we sort of started it. So, so it's two.
Megan, are we going to get a copy of the PowerPoint that Justin and Amanda just did? I know that's been revised. I think they said they started by saying it was revised from the previous one.
Yeah, and again, I think some of these iterations are happening through this process, right? So you'll see that there have been updates made to provide clarity based on the questions that we've received from the Education Finance Subcommittee, but we can absolutely share and we'll post this version.
Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, it's 2:55. Let's assume we will turn our cameras back on at 3:05. Thanks, everyone.
Megan,
Hello.
just trying to share through Teams so I could see everyone. So I was practicing.
At first I was like, oh no, I'm
No, I
typing
was
on my
just
other
saying,
screen and accidentally typing on the wrong screen. And then I realized it wasn't me.
that was me.
Welcome back, folks. I think I'm sure even folks with their camera off can probably hear us. So I'm going to turn it over to Zoe. She's going to give us an update, current status update on Listen and Learn, and we'll go from there.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to share the findings from our Listen and Learn tour. We actually will be submitting a comprehensive report with appendices. It'll be 114 pages, so it's pretty thick. So I'm going to go through some of the details. But the reason that we did that is we really wanted to make sure that for those that participated, we captured all the ideas and that we were able to document those. But it's really been a rewarding process to participate in the Listen and Learn tour and traveling all across the state. So I will share with you my screen, which we'll walk through a couple slides here. Can you see my screen? Yes, okay. It looks like it's not on presenter mode, so hold on one second. Okay. How about now? And now I can't see you, so hold on one second. This is why I'd like a double screen. Hold on one second. All right, there we go. Still can't see.
If it helps, Zoe, I can also just look at raised hands and
If you
pause
could,
you
yeah,
if needed.
thank you for that. Okay, thanks. I appreciate it. Okay, so just prepared a brief presentation to provide a reminder of why the Agency of Education engaged in the Listen and Learn tour. We'll share at a high level what we learned and what's next. The AOE is, as I mentioned in our last presentation, we're very focused on developing our strategic plan in a way that's going to promote educational quality, equity, and sustainability. And we felt it was really important to hear from Vermonters across the state to make sure that we get our plan right. Specifically, we outlined several key objectives for the Listen and Learn tour. Through this process, we seek to align the agency's work to regional priorities and the needs for communities across Vermont. We're working in partnership with communities to identify a shared vision for the future of education in Vermont as we develop our strategic plan and really think concretely around the agency's role in supporting that vision. We're looking to improve access to high-quality educational opportunities for all students. And as we learn about what's working really well in communities across the state, we are very excited to identify levers for improving student achievement. And all of this work, as we've said from the beginning, we're really looking to do in partnership with the Commission and being able to bring back the ideas and insights that we're learning to support the work of the Commission on the Future of Public Education. We started this work in August by releasing the first data profile report, and phase one involved data reporting and also coordination with superintendents. We met with the regional superintendents associations through phase one to really identify how can we approach this work in a way that will be meaningful and participatory. We got some really good feedback from the superintendents that helped us to shape phase two and phase three of the Listen and Learn tour. So phase two of our planning involved regional planning with education leaders. I'll walk through who was involved in that, but we traveled all across the state, and the idea was to be able to look at data that we had and really understand community by community what there were some nuances of really how to support those educational priorities and needs. And phase three involved public engagement sessions, educator sessions, and student focus groups. In terms of the overall number of sessions that we facilitated, we hosted 6 regional planning sessions with education leaders. We hosted 13 educator focus groups and 12 public engagement sessions. And lastly, 8 8 youth engagement sessions. We thought originally that we would see more students participating in our public engagement sessions, but when we saw that students weren't attending, we partnered with Up for Learning to support us with facilitating separate focus groups with students, and want to thank the Vermont Principals Association for really working with us to identify that as a strategy and supporting those additional sessions. When we look at the numbers of people participated, it's really exciting to see that we were able to engage with over 1,000 Vermonters across the state. And we did get broad participation from education leaders. And as we're defining education leaders in that context, we're thinking about superintendents and principals and school board members, curriculum directors, special education directors, and others that really were involved in thinking strategically around the data to identify areas of improvement and also to identify challenges. The educator sessions were largely represented by teachers and school-based faculty members. And members of the public really was a broad audience that included parents, community partners, legislators, and others. And our students were focused on middle and high school students, and we asked them to reflect on their experience both in high school and as younger learners within the Vermont system. This has been a really exciting time to get to know Vermont. We have really been going on a roadshow with our full team at the agency. This map shows all of the different locations where we visited and conducted listening sessions. The yellow dot is representing regional planning sessions, so that's with our education leaders, and we did those in 6 different areas of the state. We aligned that work to the regional associations boundaries that they work in, collaborate in. And then the pink star is representing educator and public engagement sessions. We conducted the educator sessions first, and then that evening at that same location, we had a public engagement session. The orange star is representing our student focus groups, and then the blue star is representing where we had multiple sessions. And for those blue stars, I want to really thank those schools that hosted us multiple times to support the Listen and Learn. I want to highlight some key takeaways, and then I'll break it down in terms of what we specifically heard from different stakeholder groups. Overall, it's been really consistent with our discussions at the commission level, is it's really important for us to strike the right balance between unity and freedom as we think about education matters, and making sure that we're allowing for the local customization on the ground while providing clearer guidance at a state and more targeted support to achieve those goals, particularly related to new legislation. We heard consistently a call to focus on expanding equity and access to educational opportunities. As we talked about in our prior presentation, we know that there's great variability with what schools are able to offer in terms of their existing budget, based on their existing budget constraints. We talked a lot about how do we define student success, and it was clear that Vermonters believe strongly in a holistic definition of student success. We heard certainly a need to be able to measure some of the foundational skills in literacy and math, but also being able to capture those future-ready skills that are going to be important for students in their life beyond school. We continue to hear a need for additional support and services for our special education student population, which is growing. And overall, as we think about how the complexity of the challenges before us, we heard consistently a call for greater state leadership and also an intentional focus on really strengthening and building capacity at the Agency of Education. So I'll walk through what we heard specifically from our regional planning sessions. We started those sessions by asking questions of our education leaders to help us define the regional profiles. In the report, you'll see in the appendix, we did include those profiles. It was really interesting to be able to capture from those that live and work in the area what they identify as the community assets, where they see some of the population shifts, to really understand the geography of the community, thinking about mountain ranges and rivers and highways, and thinking about how that connects or divides communities, and also thinking around the school identity in those regions. So it was really interesting and enlightening conversations that I think produced pretty good understanding of the characteristics of these regions. Within each session, we had breakout groups to really talk about some of the 3 areas that have been emerging as part of the agency's strategic plan. And one of those breakout sessions focused on academic performance and accountability. We heard very clearly, as we've repeated many times before at the commission level, the importance of reliable, transparent, and easy to understand data, and also timeliness. And this is something, as you know, that we at the agency have been working really closely on and are really proud of some of the improvements we've been able to make to achieving this. We heard also a need for greater alignment across curriculum, proficiency-based learning, local assessments, and the state assessment to really ensure that there's coherence as we're thinking about ongoing continuous improvement and differentiated instructional planning for students. As I touched on earlier in kind of the broad theme, there was a lot of conversation on the need to have holistic measures of student success, so beyond some of the traditional academic indicators. And really a need for and a desire for greater direction and support from the AOE. So not in every area, but as we've talked a lot about as we're developing our strategic plan, it's important for us to really think about what are we tight on and what are we loose on. And at the agency, the things that we're tight on, we want to make sure we can really align our efforts and support and really maximize funding available to support those areas. And areas that we're loose on, there's a lot more local customization, and those are opportunities to learn from the field and bubble up innovation. But what we heard really consistently was when there is a lack of direction, it creates a lot of extra work on the field. And so it's really important for us to balance that unity and freedom to ensuring that we're providing the right structure and guidance to actually allow that flexibility and focus on the ground to do the customization work. Another breakout group focused on college and career readiness, and we heard very consistently a desire to expand student access to flexible pathways and specifically really expanding career and technical education offerings. Through these conversations, one of the themes that came up was really a desire to have regional comprehensive high schools that combine, sorry for the typo, that combine traditional and career and technical educational offerings. And there was a lot of discussion around that kind of applied learning being a very great way to increase student engagement, reduce chronic absenteeism. We did talk in these sessions around some of the barriers to expanding access that we have documented throughout the report. The third session focused on the mental health costs and systems of support. We've been hearing consistently that there is an increased acuity of mental health needs from our students. And when we went to these sessions to propose an initial methodology to try to quantify the cost of mental health in our schools and in our districts. In these conversations, we heard certainly that there is a growing mental health needs among our students. We're hearing specifically that our younger students are often entering unprepared and displaying dysregulation behavior. We've heard a lot about the staffing shortages with mental health professionals, and also because of the challenges of this work, there's often a lot of turnover and burnout. Through these conversations, there was some discussion around really thinking about state and regional solutions to reduce cost pressures, including a continuum of services. With our school board members, we had separate breakout sessions to really think intentionally around what type of data support would be most beneficial to school boards for this budgeting session and also to inform future decision making. In these discussions, we talked sometimes about the lack of ability to compare school performance. Some of that has to do with data suppression and that we're not able for FERPA regulations to be able to reduce the performance rating for certain schools. And also sometimes there's outdated information, meaning that the state assessment data is coming out much later and is not as timely, and that there is inconsistent reporting across districts. So overall, we had some really productive conversations around how we as an agency can help to accelerate our reporting. I would like to share that we are already underway in that effort as it relates to the state assessment. We've been working with the U.S. Department of Education to make some amendments to our state plan that will allow us to report data earlier in a much more timely way. So we're looking to continue have engagement from the field on that to ensure we can deliver on that priority. We heard really loud and clear that there's a lot of confusion around our budgeting system and our overall education finance system. There's so much complexity, as we've been talking about as a commission. And so we heard really a request to provide more training and support in this area. The agency did produce the education funding report last month to really use plain language to explain our current system. And we've also, in the month of December, provided budget training support to the field to support with strategic budgeting. So just highlight that because this is kind of our first phase of our planning, and this was also in the early fall timeframe. So we were able to take some of this input as an agency and really work to respond to it to address those immediate needs. So moving into our educator focus groups, we asked questions that were really designed to elicit an understanding of how the Agency of Education can best provide academic support to the field. We heard again a need for more consistent guidance from AOE in terms of the supports and standards. There were a lot of concerns raised, as you would imagine, around the impact on budget cuts. There was a desire for more high quality professional development, but really focusing on strategies like job embedded coaching where they can apply their learning immediately and consistently. We did hear that there's also a challenge sometimes for teachers to participate in professional development because of the lack of substitutes. We heard very clearly the benefit of high quality pre-K programs and that being important to students entering kindergarten ready to be successful in school. And we've heard a lot about the need for additional support for special education students. We know many districts are struggling with shortages in terms of special education teachers. And there was a consistent theme around really building our educational pathways in a way that are going to support students to be successful, not just in high school, but beyond graduation. We asked questions around non-academic support, and we've heard a lot of discussion around schools really having to do more to meet students' basic needs, and that they're calling to partner with community services to really help to support that integrated school community coordination to meet the full needs and wraparound support of all students. There was a lot of conversation around additional behavior supports needed and being able to deliver on that mental health support. So overall, when we think about non-academic supports, the availability of community partnerships varies across the state, and sometimes that has a disproportionate impact on our smaller, more rural communities. We asked specifically around, what type of educator support the AOE can amplify to best support the field or add new in our repertoire. We heard a desire for the educators to want to see the AOE as a partner in education. Again, this consistency on the guidance came out very clearly. Our support also in looking at family engagement in education. I'll talk a little bit about this too in our public engagement sessions. There was definitely a desire from parents to be more involved and really thinking intentionally around creating that balance between local control and statewide consistency and a need to revisit that in a thoughtful way. And then teacher recruitment and retention does remain an issue, and there was a call for the agency to do more collaboration in this area. We are working very closely right now at the agency with our higher education partners to be collaborative in this area. So moving into public engagement sessions, this is an overview of who attended. We did have educators attend, parents, legislators, community members, business owners, and others. At every session, I kind of liked the other category because it feels like those folks wear so many hats that they can't categorize themselves. But we certainly had a really broad range of stakeholders engaged in these discussions. We asked questions to really think about what are the key indicators of student success. And we heard that it was important for our students to feel safe, for them to feel happy and that they feel they have belonging in their school, that they want them to be curious, excited, and engaged. We heard some folks saying, I love it when my child comes home and they're excited to share something that they learned. There certainly was a focus on making sure that our students are mastering those core academic competencies and also developing those critical life skills. As they were reflecting on success, they often thought about, well, how do students find their own path? And again, it's making that connection between what students are learning now and their success beyond graduation, and using more holistic measures. We asked questions around the kind of opportunities and experiences that all Vermont students should have. And this is where we got into very robust discussions around what it means to have equitable access to educational opportunities. There was an intent to really ensure that there is a consistent set of programs and electives and courses that students have access to, regardless of their community or their school across Vermont. We heard a lot around the need to provide the wraparound social emotional learning and support needs for students, and thinking intentionally around how we can best differentiate and individualize instruction. Heard a lot of conversation around really applicable learning, thinking about real world, hands-on instruction, cross-curricular lesson plans that really excite students and incite their interest in learning new things. We heard a call for schools to have a stronger connection with families, communities, and their outside partners. And again, a more unified and state-driven approach in key areas. Budget sustainability was a primary focus of these conversations, and was a lens as people thought about how do you make these decisions around what defines educational equity and quality in our system. It's clear that our communities are facing budget challenges, and a lot of that's due to declining enrollment and rising cost in different areas. There was a lot of conversation around increased resource sharing, the need to think about regionalization and consolidation as well, as we think through different strategies to promote educational quality and also the sustainability of our system. Overall, there was also conversations around how we can improve state level capacity and really thinking about cross-agency partnerships in supporting education. And finally, we had youth engagement sessions with our high school and middle school students. I think our students were really clear when we asked them, what are the strengths of your system and what do you want to see in the education system? Students reflected on the strengths of the system being our teachers and our staff, and that they really felt like their teachers and educators in the building are working very intentionally to create a strong sense of community and inclusivity. They did note challenges related to behavior issues and sometimes inconsistency with the discipline responses, and a need for more effective and consistent restorative practices. Students desired more expanded learning opportunities. They talked a lot about having more internships, real world experiences beyond the classroom, exposure to career possibilities, more advanced coursework, and more personalized learning. When we ask students to reflect on the resources that are needed in schools, they talked about their needing high quality and skilled teachers who they can build strong relationships with, access to a lot of different learning opportunities and choices that would challenge students and also support their learning needs. Students in these conversations talked a lot about really creating those connections between what they're learning in the classroom and what that means in the real world in terms of opportunity and future career paths. Students also reflected on the mental health support needs and additional academic needs to ensure that they can thrive, and thinking overall around the environment of the school and being well maintained and welcoming, and creating that strong sense of community. And then of course, kids want those opportunities to have fun and be a kid. And so the traditions of the school are also important. So in terms of what's next and what we've done so far in response to a lot of the feedback we've received, we've made some significant data infrastructure improvements and enhancements to our data reporting. We've launched Read Vermont, which we're modeling a new way for the Agency of Education to provide more targeted support in the field for major legislation, and to support with some consistency as we think about promoting literacy outcomes statewide. We've launched a number of budget training sessions and resources, and we are in the process of enhancing our state assessment reporting and training to create that greater coherence with what's happening in the classroom day to day, and also more timely data reporting. So where we're going, we will release the full report of all of these findings this week. Our staff at the agency have already been really engaged in this work. So every month at the agency, we've come together and we've reflected on what we have learned at that point of the listen and learn, and we've done our best to incorporate and respond to that feedback. And now we're working on division planning, where we're bringing together all of this learning, we're bringing together all the data that we've looked at, and working with each division to really think about the core processes and programs that we implement at the agency. And all of this work will culminate with our final strategic plan, which will include multi-year goals and initiatives. And our intent here is that the agency's strategic plan is really reflective of the needs of our community, and also very much supports and amplifies the expertise we have at the agency to support the state in achieving our shared goals. So I'll stop sharing at this point and see if anyone has questions. I ran through it pretty quickly because I just felt like I was short on time. The only other last thing I want to say is I really want to thank everyone who came out. I mean, it was really wonderful to have this opportunity to travel all across the state and engage with Vermonters who really care deeply about education. And we've really valued to learn through this process as an agency. We've heard some really great ideas and suggestions. And where there are questions and concerns, we've acknowledged them and we've worked really hard to respond to them.
Peter, and then Jennifer.
Great, thank you. I think this Listen and Learn tour was great that you did it. I think it really has a lot more people involved than we've had so far in our commission public engagement, yet the themes really all seem to be the same. And so it's a nice confirmation for us from what we've heard and what I've heard at the table talk. I was just sort of jotting some notes down as you were going through. And a lot of them sort of reflect back on the AOE and what its role is going to be in the future and how it can fulfill that role. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about the process that you're going to go through now to reevaluate what the AOE's role is, especially under the auspices of listen, learn, lead? And then, of course, as a legislator, what I'm most interested in is the capacity, staffing. Do you have what you need to meet that vision? I understand, the vision comes first and then got to get the capacity to do it.
Yeah, so, we've said from the beginning that this process should help the agency align our work to meet the needs of the field, and to really be intentional around prioritizing what we focus on and how we support our educators and our school districts. So one thing I would reflect on is just the input we received already has allowed us to be more responsive and allowed us to think more intentionally about where we need to invest our time and resources. So some of that is already coming into play. As you can see, we've really focused on, increasing our support around the budgeting process. We've focused on increasing our support around Act 139 and literacy overall. And that's really in direct response to the needs of what we're hearing across the state. We've been bringing our agency staff, so we have all agency staff meetings every month. And as we're listening to this, we're really reflecting on the degree to which we're able to deliver on this work to the expectation. We've often reflected that we're a small and mighty team, and that we hit above our weight class, and I think our team's really proud of that. And we're really working intentionally to, how do we best support the field? Part of this overall strategic planning process is also thinking about, as we think about the priorities of the state, it's also thinking about the priorities of the agency and being intentional about where we need different expertise and at what level. So all of that will be part of this next part of the process as we look at division planning. And I think to your question, really being mindful around capacity and where there are areas where we may need to build our capacity or reprioritize our efforts to ensure that we have the resources and bandwidth to deliver on those expectations.
If I could just follow up on one thing, this isn't a question, just a little bit of history for those who might be saying, well, you know, if the AOE has been doing this and sort of coming up with their vision, yet that's also a task that is assigned to the Commission on the Future of Public Education. Much of that is due to the fact that the legislation and the legislature was on a little bit of a different schedule than Secretary Saunders getting in her position and figuring out how she was going to be spending her first year in the position. And I think that hearing this report, I think there's great opportunities going forward for sort of all of that to become much more, you know, interwoven together.
Jennifer, go ahead.
Sure, thanks. So thank you very much for compiling that report, because I always know these reports are like the tip of an iceberg, and there was a lot of data that went into that. And I also just want to acknowledge this was, I mean, when Zoe was still a candidate for secretary, this was one of her ideas. So it's really nice to see that, you know, you were able to follow through and to have such a you know, rich data collection point that came out of it. So thank you. My question, and I'm just kind of curious, with the students, and they were talking about like the inconsistency with discipline, was that like within a classroom, within a school, within a district, or, you know, state to state? And I'm wondering if this is an opportunity of, you know, when you're hearing that people want more consistency, is this one of those examples of maybe there should be, you know, more consistency in, you know, how schools and teachers approach, you know, different behavioral issues that occur in the classroom?
Yeah, so I think this is, so one, thank you for noting that. This is something, it's really exciting for me to see this come together, because you're right, even when I was just thinking about this job, I was excited to really start by traveling across the state. And I did think it was really important for me as a new leader to Vermont to really orient myself to the state and get this opportunity to learn. And I think what was really rewarding about this experience is that it was done in partnership with an incredible team at the agency. I mean, we were all kind of traveling across the state together, and it was a great way for us to learn and really build some cohesion around our priorities as an agency, and how we can best tap into the expertise of our talented team members. But related to your specific question around discipline, students were talking about how discipline is implemented differently within their school setting. So in some contexts, students were talking about that, you know, from classroom to classroom. In some contexts, they might have been talking about it based on their prior experience as a student in an elementary or middle school, but just that there's a lot of variability with how different behavioral issues were managed. I think on the teacher side, we also heard a need for additional support around behavior management. So as we're talking about the agency, thinking about what type of training can we provide, and make sure that there's the right support in place for the teachers and helping to set those expectations. And a lot of that can be done too within our multi-tiered system of support, which, you know, our team is really proud of, looking at both behavior and academics as a way to differentiate our support for students.
Thank you.
Mike, and then I'm going to attempt to segue us.
Thanks, Zoe, and I appreciated seeing the report as well. I was at, I think, was it the first session for education leaders?
Yes.
And a lot of the things you talked about in your report are items that we talked about as a group. So I appreciate that. My question is just more of an open-ended question. It seems you have a lot of themes, you have a lot of threads that I think are going to be helpful moving forward. What kind of open questions do you still have, having gone through a pretty extensive tour and conversation?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I'll respond first to your first comment. Thank you. I'm glad that what I shared is reflective of the conversation. That's really important to us at the agency, that this gives voice to the suggestions, ideas, concerns, questions of the field. So thank you for that initial feedback, and I welcome further feedback once you get a chance to look at the full report. In terms of open questions, you know, as we've gone through our work, sometimes there's a disconnect between theory and action. I think there's a lot of really well-intentioned ideas that have been thoroughly researched, and sometimes we have a challenge in the state of implementation. And I think that's where we've heard that come out in the themes through these discussions. So as we as an agency begin to really define what are we tight on, what are the areas that we're really going to focus on because they're most important to elevating outcomes for the state, the questions become, how do we do that really effectively, and that we can support a fidelity of implementation that really yields the intended outcomes. So the only way I think to do that effectively is to continue with our approach, which is very collaborative and data-driven. So as we go into this next phase of really thinking about specific targets and initiatives built into that model, we're going to create an evaluation component. So we have the opportunity to really evaluate in real time how effective we are as a state in achieving our goals and the degree to which the initiatives from the state level are supporting that. And so I'm envisioning that we'll have short kind of evaluation cycles where we can be able to adjust and review as we go. So I think really the open question as we move forward is how do we really develop a plan that will be a working document to support really effective implementation of initiatives. And we're focused very clearly on it being data-driven, action-oriented, and also focused on results for students. So that's the kind of exciting part next, because we really get into developing approaches that are going to really yield those desired outcomes, and doing that in partnership with our districts and our teachers and communities.
Thank you.
Thanks, Zoe. That was really helpful, even as someone sort of tangentially seeing it along the way, and I look forward to seeing the report. One of the things that it's a comment and then a segue, I kind of want to elevate Peter's comment at the end. So in many ways, there are parts of our task as a commission that have run into this work, and not because anyone is trying to take away the work or direct the work of the other. I think it's representative of in trying to solve this complex issue, we need to know what our public believes about our education. We need to look at data. We need to weigh what's been done. And this process didn't exist when this commission was launched. I think it's really important for certainly the legislature to take stock of now what is the right role for the commission, and what is the right, the agency has a role. This is a really important summary of sort of the path that didn't exist perhaps when this commission existed. And we've had some really important conversations as a commission. So the comment is we've touched on it when we have input sessions. We already have, we had people that weren't sure which input session was which. And I think it's just a product of two structures touching each other. And now I think it's really important to pay attention to what is our role as a commission. And the segue part of my comment is, we had a kind of open-ended conversation that sort of touched on this. We've been talking about Workplan, but this is really a refinement of our potential work. And it feels like not only do we want to hear from the legislature about what they believe our purpose is and whether or not it's refined, but also do we have opinions that we would want the legislature to hear about what our work should be? I think that's a worthwhile conversation. I'm not suggesting we try to push that into 3 minutes today, but I think that's part of why that's part of what the steering group should think about as they think of at least our next immediate agenda when they meet next week. And so our agenda item right now is to any sort of hanging thoughts that commission members wanted to share about the Brainstorm document / work plan, but also potential agenda items for February 3rd. In other words, the steering group meets next Monday. I think they have a lot to digest just from today's conversation, potentially some early things from this first week of the session. What is it, commission members, what should the steering group think about as they plan our next few meetings and conversations? That's a big question, but John.
I try to measure my words on this. I think it's really careful. We have to be very careful about striking the right balance. I agree with what you said, Megan, that the partnership we have with the agency is important. The information that the agency is gleaning through their processes is important, but the commission needs to be independent. It's not an extension of the administration. And I'm concerned, given where we ended up with the interim report, that there were policy recommendations made by the secretary. We didn't make policy recommendations, but the secretary's policy recommendations were included in the report. And I'm, feel like the agenda today was primarily given over to the administration. And so this is all important information, things that we need to hear, but I do think we have to strike a balance between that and not being seen as an extension of the administration and being an independent commission.
Thanks, John. Just one quick sort of reaction to that. That's what I think we need to lean into as a commission, is how do we, to what extent is it helpful for that neutral examination? And if so, what do we then need to be able to do that? Is there, I'll just give the example of, we heard presentations about data from the agency. If there is a desire for different presentations, we need to very quickly be thinking about what's the infrastructure associated with that. So because there's a difference between being neutral and also not being repetitive. So I think that's part of the conversation. Oliver.
Yeah, I think I go back to the plan, and I think where the steering group could have some conversation is around setting some realistic expectations around what can be delivered by October, right? Because I think that's the first, there needs to be something for the public to react to in October. And, as I count back from there, we have 8 meetings from February until then to produce something. So I think that's the first question is that a realistic amount of time given the current structure of the commission? And if not, what is realistic? And I think that goes back to sort of informing, the legislature and to think about what the commission's role could be going forward. And if there is a desire to have something delivered and ready for public comment for October, I do think we're going to have to radically reshape the structure, our committee structure. There needs to be more division of responsibility, and probably some more, time, some committee time to really dive into these things. Otherwise, I just don't think it's realistic that we're going to have something of substance ready for public review by October.
Thanks, Oliver. And again, I think that's part of why whether we are waiting for the legislature to refine or suggesting what to refine, that's real. And I think that's sort of what I was getting at with the repetitive. I don't know that our job is to stand up a completely parallel process. I think the weight of our charge was largely related to an absence of that structure and information. That does not mean we can't be a body that is a critical eye to things being lifted up. And I think that's an important role. Jennifer, and then what I'm going to do is lean on the steering group to take today's conversation into account for next week.
Well, I was just remembering too, thank you. We have a whole list of people with whom we are supposed to be consulting, and we haven't invited any of them in. So I think we probably, maybe this segues into what should the steering committee be talking about at its next meeting. We might want to take a look at that list and start prioritizing and having people come in and meet with the commission.
Yes, thank you. And just a quick piece, that is why we had lifted a communication and engagement subcommittee, waiting for the consultant to sit down with us. And one of the things that consultant needs to do is say, of this list of folks, what is the right way that we would engage these various audiences? So I think we're all talking about the same thing. I think we've been really focused on the December report, and it's that's what we have to do now, is figure out how we will spend our time from now until October, to your point, Oliver. Jeff, really quick, and then I'm gonna give an opportunity for public comment.
Sure. Two things then quickly. I know we talked about it earlier about the consultant that we have as opposed to the two that the AOE just hired. So getting an update on that and when we can start working with that consultant sooner rather than later would be helpful, I think. Because we just saw a presentation from the AOE's consultants, and there's certainly some bona fides there to examine and look at, but we could do the same and should do the same. And the other is, how do I make additions or edits or whatever to the working document? Because I'm not part of that. I thought I made an edit previously. They don't seem to be captured there, and I'm wondering why that is not. Why is that so? And how do I go about making edits to the working document?
I would say two things. The first, in terms of the consultant, I think that Zoe, you, this is a question for you. Would it be possible to have an update on the communication consultant status contract to the steering group next week? Awesome. Okay, so that's the first question, Jeff, is
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to put it out there and get some firmness to that answer. Thank you, Zoe.
Yes. Thank you. And then the second piece, the working document is a document of the Ed Finance Subcommittee, which is, at least as of this moment, scheduled to meet next week. And so I would say, to be really, really concrete, I would send thoughts you have, Jeff, to Emily as the chair of that group. And I'm happy to forward them to you to her, if it's easier for you to send them to me.
No, I can do that. So thank you.
Yep. Okay. Folks from the public, we are a little past time, but not too much past. Is there anyone who would like to make a comment to the commission? I see Alan's hand, so I'm going to let Alan Gilbert start, and then others, if you are interested, raise your hand.
Thank you. I have to find my document here that I so painstakingly wrote. Thank you for giving us a chance to speak. I wanted to talk to today's foundation formula presentation. And somehow labeling a funding formula as a student-centered formula seems to provide a mask that provides an opportunity to call it something other than what at its core it still is, which is a foundation formula. To my mind, one of the most important sentences in the Brigham decision is this one. Quote, equal opportunity does not necessarily require precisely equal per capita expenditures, nor does it necessarily prohibit cities and towns from spending more on education if they choose, but it does not allow a system in which educational opportunity is necessarily a function of district wealth. There's another piece of Brigham that I think is also important to consider. And this piece doesn't get much attention because it was presented in the Brigham briefs, but not decided. It's the claim to taxpayer equity based on the, quote, proportional burden clause of Article 9 of Chapter 1 of the state constitution. It states that every member of society hath a right to be protected in the enjoyment of life, liberty, and property, and therefore is bound to contribute the member's proportion towards the expense of that protection. This clause has long been eyed by those involved in tax policy questions as an opportunity for the state Supreme Court to define fair taxation. The court, however, in Brigham stayed clear of a ruling on this issue. The court said the state hadn't adequately briefed its position. This meant that further consideration of the claim would require additional litigation. The case would need to return to the trial court level, a prospect that neither the state nor the plaintiffs viewed with much enthusiasm. When in June 1997 Act 60 became law, the parties agreed to drop any further claims and to ask the court to close the case. A determination of what constitutes, quote, a proportional burden was left for another day. I think it's very important to consider this equity demand as well as the common benefits equity demand when considering changes to the current school funding system. We cannot try end runs around core commitments in our state constitution.
the least changed constitution among all state constitutions. Our Constitution reflects, more than any other state's constitution, the goals of equity that our founders saw as critical in forming and sustaining a democracy. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Any other members of the public? Okay, I don't see any hands or unmutes. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to our presenters for today. Our next meeting as a steering group, the steering group has a meeting next Monday. It is virtual and it is at 9 a.m. And the Finance Committee also has a meeting at 10 a.m. So that information will be on our website. And the next commission meeting is scheduled for February 3rd, and we're in the process of confirming location for that. So thanks, everyone. We are adjourned.